In celebration of our 1 year anniversary, we are resharing our very first podcast episode featuring our founder, Bob Barron. We will be back with new episodes in August. Enjoy the episode and have a wonderful summer.
Hello, and welcome to the Books Uncovered podcast, a brand new podcast from Fulcrum Publishing, where we explore the world of books and the people who make up the publishing industry. I am Sam Shinta, publisher at Fulcrum Publishing, and I'm joined by my co-host, Kateri Kramer, Fulcrum's marketing director. Hi, Kateri, how you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. I'm excited to get this going.
Yes, same here. How are things out in Colorado?
They're good. Warm, pretty toasty. We had a little bit of rain the last couple of days, but other than that, we've been in like the high 80s, 90s. So we're fully in summer in this neck of the woods.
Excellent.
How about you guys?
Yeah, it's warm. We're getting a little bit of a cool down today, but we got some much needed rain over the weekend, which is always great. Damper on the weekend plans, but that's okay.
Yeah.
You know that we'll trade it for green plants and green lawns any day of the week.
Exactly.
Well, this is an exciting new endeavor here. And as I mentioned, we'll be talking with lots of people from the publishing industry, both from Fulcrum and some of Fulcrum's authors, as well as outside of Fulcrum, people who run bookstores, people who are working in marketing and publicity, people who are doing editorial jobs, because what we want to offer the listener is a comprehensive look at what's going on in publishing today. From top to bottom, including all aspects of the industry. I think this is one of those industries that people know about, but really don't understand what happens behind the scenes. And the hope is that perhaps this podcast can bring some of these stories to the front so that people understand what goes on in the book world. So our first guest today, we're starting right at the top here. Our guest today is Bob Barron. Bob Barron is the founder and chair of Fulcrum Publishing. And in addition to his work at Fulcrum, he has had a very rich career. He is the founder of the International League of Conservation Writers and has served as the chair, among other organizations, of the American Antiquarian Society, the president of the Denver Public Library Friends Foundation, the vice chair of the Massachusetts Audubon Society, chair of the Wild Foundation, a director of the Thoreau Society, and the founder and CEO of Prime Computer. He has authored and co-authored over 30 books, including The 20th Century, 100 Influential People, Hudson's Story of a River, Pioneers and Plotters, and The Light Shines from the West. Welcome, Bob Barron. It is great to see you. How are you doing today?
Doing well. The Avalanche
Excellent.
won last night, so we're all flying high.
Yes, Colorado has something to celebrate today. That is just fantastic. I've seen some of the news coverage. Well, congratulations to those of you out in Colorado for the Stanley Cup victory of the Colorado Avalanche. So, Bob, we want to talk a little bit about Fulcrum, obviously, and why Fulcrum and where this all came from. And you've shared a story many times over the years with staff and with some others, but I'd love for you to just share it with our listeners of the genesis of Fulcrum. Where did this idea come from? How did you arrive at creating a book publishing company in the mid-'80s? What was the spark for that?
I came out to see my oldest friend, who I've known since I was a child, Hunter Holloway. He worked for the Department of the Interior. He was writing some of James Watt's speeches, and I was vice chair of Mass Audubon, which is the parents of National Audubon. Anyway, we went up to the backcountry of Yellowstone, walked in for about, it seemed like days, but it was not. I thought I could keep up with Hunter, but he was head of mountain rescue for the state, so I sort of dragged myself. We got into the backcountry, we built a tent, and it started to rain. And it rained solidly for 2.5 days. We spent one day saying, why aren't you a woman? Or why didn't you bring some liquor in? And then we started talking about environmental issues. And because we were old friends, we could talk and listen to each other. And we realized we agreed on about 80 or 90% of everything. It was the 10% was policy. And in the environmental field at that time, everybody's shouting and nobody's listening. That same thing applies today to so many issues. So when we got out and walked back to civilization, we decided we were going to go hire 3 or 4 authors and get them to write books on various environmental issues. Public lands, acid rain, etc. I assumed when the books came in, or the manuscripts, I'd go talk to Hal Miller at Houghton Mifflin, who's an old friend, or somebody else, and get them published. But in the 9 months that the books were being created, I finally decided I wanted to start a book publishing organization myself. I was tired of the high technology, which has a breakthrough every day and no real stability. And I was always been fascinated with very creative people. And I was fortunate to get in the ground floor of the space program, and semiconductor program, and mini computers. So as the books were going, Hunter and I decided we'd start the company. And the question is, where did I want to live? There was nothing holding me back in Massachusetts. I'm from the West. I'd gone into Boston after I got out of the service for what I thought was a year or two. And it turned out it was about 20 years. So I came out here and we started Fulcrum. The idea being fundamentally twofold. One, that the history of America, and especially the history of the West, is our relationship to the land. And so that was a foundation. And the second thing is, there's so many stories that have never been told. If I was starting this in Boston, what else could I say about the Battle of Lexington and Concord that somebody didn't say better 100 years ago? But there literally are hundreds of stories here that have never been told. So we started with the land and conservation. That led us into Native Americans, who have a different point of view, much more advanced. That led us into gardening. That led us into Western history. That led us into women's books, because most history books, only talk about Revolutionary War and the Civil War. They don't talk at all about the West, and they certainly don't talk about women. So one thing led to another, and we just kept doing bigger and better books. We've now done over 1,000. We've got authors from all 50 states. We've had that for a long time. We've got authors from overseas. But we see things differently than if I was in Boston or New York. I just got back this past weekend with a high school reunion. I went to Regis High School in Manhattan because my father had moved from the West back to New York. And while I like New York, I kiss the ground when I come out here and see the trees and the air and everything. So that's how we got the company started. And we've been fortunate. We've had some great authors. We've had some great staff. And we're plowing fields that haven't been plowed before.
You talk about seeing things different from the way maybe publishers do in the East. How would you describe that? What really stands out to you in terms of how an independent publisher that's not based in the East Coast is maybe able to see the world a little differently?
Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, publishing was done by very small companies. Knopf in the 1930s, I think, had about 100 people. Houghton Mifflin, which goes back, did not have huge growth. So one thing that's happened is that since we started, companies keep buying companies and then selling to bigger companies and so on. So one of the things is that there's this fallacy in New York that there's an economy of scale. There's no economy of scale in life. I've written a lot about that in my business writings, but it's certainly not true in publishing. I can't get 25 people to write War and Peace this weekend. I can't get 100 people to write Huck Finn. A book is written by one person. So that this economy of scale is really wrong. And what they've done is they've frozen a lot of mid-list authors out. So that's one thing. The second thing, which I wrote about in the book on the West, Light Shines in the West, I think we're a lot more friendly out here. We don't measure people in terms of who their great-grandfather was. In the South and in the West and New England, a lot of it is who your great-grandparents were, where they were at Harvard, et cetera. We're all new, almost all new. So that's a piece of it. We're much more personable. It goes back to the way Knopf, Houghton Mifflin, Scribner's were built. The second thing is we're telling different stories. The colonial experience ended more than 200 years ago. The Civil War ended 150 years ago. I had two great-grandfathers in the Civil War, and I followed that. But there's so much that's happened in the 20th century, and especially post World War II, that are new stories. And so we're getting those done. There's no magic about this. It's the way publishing has always been. A great writer, a great editor, and backed up with a great production and marketing support. So that's the way we've tried to do it. And we're having fun doing it.
Now, in 2024, Fulcrum will celebrate its 40th anniversary, which is a rare anniversary for a small independent press. You know, many presses don't make it that long. And I mean, obviously, in a lot of little ways, the publishing industry has changed a lot over the 40 years. Do you see it as a different industry today than it was, say, 40 years ago when you first started, or even 30 years ago?
Well, there are those people who think it's been going downhill since Gutenberg. I've got a few friends in the rare book world that talk about that. Hal Miller, who ran Houghton for a long time and is a fishing buddy, pointed out that when he started at Houghton right after World War II, there were 50 publishers doing elementary and high school books. There are now 4, and 3 of them are owned by Europeans. So we're teaching kids with management that doesn't really know anything about American history. I think distribution has changed, but that's always been the case. In my lifetime, we used to go to a department store to buy books. Now most people don't even know what a department store is. Then we went to Walden's and Dalton's and shopping centers, and then we went to independent bookstores, and then we went to Books A Million and many of the other chains, and now we've got Amazon. So we're reaching authors and book publishers are reaching customers differently. But what hasn't changed is the importance of a really good story, a really good book. And the other thing is a belief that things take time. I've gotten periodically from some of the New York houses, here's what they're going to do next year, and I can buy the paperback rights. The book isn't even out yet, and yet they're trying to sell off the rights. We've got books we've been in business for almost 40 years. We've got books that are still selling at 40 years. Joe Bruzak and Michael Caduto did Keepers of the Earth I'm trying to remember, about 1987 or 1988. That book is still selling. We've sold over 1 million copies of that book. The first year we sold 3,000. Books last, not all books, but in my personal library, both here and at home, I've got books that were done before my grandfather was born. So unlike any other form of communication, books can last. Newspapers can't, magazines don't, television shows don't. Also, all three of those live off of advertising, which means when things are good, their business is good. And when things are bad, they're in big trouble. Books have to stand on their own. And we don't try to publish the celebrity du jour. New York must have done by now 40 or 50 different books by people who worked for Trump. None of those books will last very long. But I've got some books that we've signed that'll be out this year and next year that I can guarantee will be in print 25 years from now. That's a big difference. I think the other thing, and when I wrote Pioneers and Plotters, I point this out. In the auto industry, all the auto companies were started by engineers. In the computer industry, the managers and the founders of every computer company in the 60s were technical people, either engineers, programmers, or marketing. We've got people running publishing companies like we've got people running other companies who don't even know what the hell their products are, don't know what their customers look like. We want, I get in trouble when I say this in Boston, but I really think it's right that no high-tech company ever got founded by anybody who went to Harvard. I got quoted in the Boston Globe saying that. I didn't remember saying it, but I could have very well have said it. You've got this idea, you go to Harvard, you go to a business school, and you learn about numbers, and you learn about finance, but you don't learn about people. And business is people. And that's especially true when you're talking about writing. Writers are individuals. And so right from the beginning, we've been an author-oriented company. And we will be that way not only through my lifetime, but from now on. Again, to do a book, you need a really great writer and a great editor and patience, and you're going to do fine.
I'm curious, Bob, what do you think it takes? Actually, Sam as well, I'd love to know your opinion about this, but what is it that makes a book something that sticks around for 40 years and is always on people's bookshelves, and maybe they pull it out every couple of years and reread it?
Well, if I knew that, I would own every publishing company in America. You can say what won't make it.
Sure.
The celebrity du jour, the Me Too books, what makes it is somebody who's got something to say that's different, that's important, and so on. And well, let me just draw an analogy. When I was in the space business, we put the computers on Mariner that went to Venus and Mars. Mariner 1 blew up in the launch pad. Mariner 2 went to Venus. Mariner 3 almost took out Baltimore. It was going the wrong direction.
Oh,
Mariner
no.
Mariner 4 went to Mars. That's batting 500. Now the space program, no, you got to bat 100. You got to bat 1,000, which means you don't do anything. So you got to, same thing with books. You've got to have enough patience as well as enough excitement about authors. But which ones go? There's so many stories of authors who couldn't get their books anywhere. And then it suddenly becomes a classic. In children's, it's easy because if you love a children's book, you'll give it to your children and you give it to your grandchildren and so on. But books on some other subjects become that way because it becomes the definitive book. Empty Cradle, which we did that because 2 of the editors had lost a child. We didn't know that. One was stillborn. And that book has become a classic. I can tell you which ones I think will come out, but I've got books that have sold large numbers more than I ever expected. And I've got other books that I've got Christmas presents for eternity. My friends all get books from me because I thought this was a great book and somebody didn't. But again, you can't have, you got to take chances. And the more you merge, the more overhead you got. And so, quote, a midlist book, which used to be 3,000, then was 10,000. Now it's 25,000. So they miss the books that are going to take time to go.
Yeah.
The story that I always share with people is the story of Herman Melville, who was working in the customs houses at the end of his life because he couldn't support himself as an author. Moby Dick actually sold 3,000 copies in his lifetime and was considered a failure. Now it is probably one of the top 2 or 3 candidates for great American novel. Yeah. But that didn't happen until after his lifetime. It took a long time for that to progress and for people to discover the book and to understand what Melville was doing. And it was also, for its time, an incredibly risky book that he wrote. It was not a traditional narrative. It wasn't done in the way that, fiction was done at that time. And so the times caught up with it. But again, we see that Thoreau with Walden, it was a moderate success in his lifetime, and then basically becomes the linchpin of the American environmental movement.
Yeah.
So, you just have to take that long view. And that's what I respect so much about Bob, and something I think he's really taught Fulcrum, is that everything we do, we're doing with that long view. We're doing with the idea that this book should still matter 25 or 50 years from now. And all of them necessarily won't make it, but we're positioning them in a way that they could do that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thoreau sold less than 4,000 copies of books in his lifetime. He had a sister who, to be politically correct, I would just say she was aggressive. She went after Emerson, and through Emerson got some of his stuff published, and then it's took off. And so my first advice to authors is be nice to your sister, because she's going to outlast you. And but no, you got warehouses filled with books that never should have been published, or if they were, they should have been published as 100 copies. Nobody's done a really great book yet on Nixon or even more on Trump. We've got all these gossip kinds of books, which are really just People magazine articles. They're not really books. One example, the year 2000 was one of the 4 elections that was tied. The Supreme Court got involved and so on. We didn't publish anything on that election, but that year we published a book on the election of 1800, two centuries earlier, where it went to the House of Representatives 53, I think it was 53 votes. And eventually Jefferson won over both Adams and what's his name? I can't even remember his name now. And if Jefferson had not gotten it, I'd be talking to you in either French or Spanish or Russian, because only Jefferson had the courage for the Louisiana Purchase. So things take time, but things take time in every other aspect of your life. Relationships, hobbies, volunteer organizations, all of those. So everything we've ever tried to do, we do with a long-term view. And most of the time we're right, some of the time we're wrong, but we don't bet the farm on one book. We just find great authors like Vine Deloria. We did one book with him, and that book is now going to, Sam, isn't it going to be 50th anniversary edition of that book?
Yep, next year.
That's not too bad.
Bob, what are some of the books on your shelf that you always go back to or that you really like to give as gifts?
Let me start with the authors.
Yeah, that works too.
I have Twain. I've always collected Twain. I've got a whole couple shelves of first edition Twain. I managed to read him a lot. I like Dickens. I gave a talk a week ago on Churchill, who's phenomenally good. I try, in fact, I'm reading him right now. I go back to E.B. White and I go to Ernie Pyle. I'm studying the mid-20th century because we're starting a project on Colorado for its 150th anniversary. So I try to read E.B. White. I try to read Pyle at least once every 2 years. I don't think I can say that there's one history that I have to read, but what I do is I love history and I also love humor. And I sometimes, depending on what's happening in the world, either have to get a historical viewpoint or not take it too seriously.
Yeah. What about you, Sam?
Oh, the authors that I go back to.
Yeah.
Twain's my big one. I mean, I reread Huck Finn every year or so. Fitzgerald, I love Fitzgerald. Oh golly, I'm just looking at my shelves. John McPhee is one, the essayist. I just love reading McPhee's stuff over and over again. He's just such a great craftsperson, and so he helps to make me be a better writer along the way. But I like discovering new stuff too. So I just go all over. I'm an omnivore when it comes to books. I do some of the same books, but I also love to just branch out into all different genres and new authors, discovering all the time.
Yeah.
I also go back, and at least once a year, go back to the Greeks and the Romans. Their views of life and philosophy are very, very important. And you can complicate life, and you can complicate your own relationships. But there's so many great writers and thinkers from 2000 BC to no, 300 AD. So I will read somebody in that thing. I used to read them in the original Latin, but those days are long gone. But I've got a couple friends who can translate for me. And in fact, when Trump was misbehaving, one of our authors started quoting Roman writers about the emperor, and that put everything in perspective.
How about you, Kateri? What do you like to revisit?
Every Christmas I go back and I read Jazz by Toni Morrison. It's maybe the most important book on my bookshelf to me. I also always find myself rereading Jack Gilbert. He's a poet, and I don't know, there's something really, really special about his poetry. And I go back to that, just like kind of flipping through the book to whatever comes up a couple times a year. I love Hemingway, his short stories. I find myself reading every couple of months, just again, flipping through and finding something. Those are probably my three big ones. I have like a stack of jazz books that I've gotten whenever I see it when I'm at a bookstore, because it's the book that I gift to the most people. So I keep like 8 of them around.
Just to keep handing out.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just wonderful how visiting old books can be like visiting old friends.
Yeah.
One that I've talked with Bob about that I also like to revisit is Dante's Paradiso, Purgatorio, and Inferno.
Oh,
The
yeah.
Divine Comedy. Oh goodness, the Divine Comedy. But I love to read different translations of that too. And much like Bob is talking about with the Greeks and the Romans, reading Dante just puts everything in perspective for you, and reminds you of all the earthly delights and also all the follies of life along the way.
Yeah. I mean, that's what a really good book does, right? It gives us a different perspective, makes us a little bit more empathetic to the things we have or we don't have or we don't understand.
I'm rereading for about the 5th time Canterbury Tales. 7 centuries later, it's still absolutely wonderful. And you can find different translations. Most of them, and they get rid of the poetry and they translate it into prose, and the prose stories are still great. But if you have somebody do a really good poetic translation, you just get wrapped up, and that's 7 centuries ago.
Absolutely. So Bob, as Fulcrum is approaching 40 years, just one final question. I'm kind of curious about this, and I think I know the answer, but I'd love to hear your articulation. Do you feel hopeful about the future of the publishing industry, especially for small independent publishers?
I think, if anything, writers are more important than when we started 40 years ago. 40 years ago, you could pick up Time magazine or Life or Newsweek and learn a lot. Those magazines are not very good today. You used to be able to watch a lot of really good television, and I don't think we've got nearly the scripts that we've had in the past. At least books. That's number one. Who writes, who the publishers are, how they distribute will change. But one of the 2 big benefits of this virus is that people read more. They couldn't go out, they couldn't spend time in groups. So people read. And the other thing they did was go outside. And we're involved with both of those. So I don't think Canterbury Tales talks about a time when the world changed. Well, I think the world has changed as a result of this problem. People are rethinking their priorities in life. So we're going to try to have books and authors that talk to them in a different way than they did when I was getting out of school. And the idea was you worked for a large corporation, you had them tell you what to do, you transferred whenever they told you to do. The Organization Man is probably the classic book on that score. People are much more open to life. And a part of that, a very important part, which is we're just getting into, is what's happened in the world of women. In 1940, 1950, women were told, get a good husband, or if you can't do that, there's three professions. You can become a nurse, you can become a teacher, or you can become a secretary. We've got more than half the people in medical school, half the people in law school, more than half in college. Those women are going to take over the world. And I think it's absolutely great. They're not going to put up with some of the bullshit, pardon my French, but some of the bullshit that we did. I've got a friend I had lunch with about 2 weeks ago. IBM transferred him 7 times. His wife and kids just got picked up and went. The 8th time, he said, no, that's not it. The young kids aren't going to put up with that. Especially since the very large corporations, by and large, which used to have loyalty up and down, don't have loyalty. They fire people who make the mistake of turning 50. So we've got a changing world, and we want to get the best writers to talk about that, to talk about the aging of America, to talk about the roles of women are doing, changing in family situations. It's no longer life with father, with a husband, a wife, and 2 kids. It's a great time because when you write, you're writing stories that have not been told before. So I'm very optimistic.
Well, I want to thank you for all of these insights, and obviously for your leadership over the years, and for your sense of mission, which has made Fulcrum what it is today. And thank you again for joining us as our first guest here on the new podcast.
My pleasure.
Well, Kateri, that was a wonderful conversation, and thanks for jumping in on that question of books that we revisit. I think that that's just such a fantastic question. And you know, as Bob was talking and you were talking, I keep going back and thinking, oh yeah, and this author and this author and this author.
Me
you know,
too.
You just get off the top of your head, and then you start thinking of all the old friends that you like to bring back into your world every once in a while.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, one of our former authors, the deceased, sadly late Governor Dick Lamb, Colorado, just was a wonderful mentor and a wonderful author and just a wonderful human being. And one of the things I loved most about Dick was every time that I would meet with him, and he did this with anybody. One of the things that he would do upon, you know, wrapping up the meeting, we'd have our business meeting, we'd talk shop, and then he'd say, so, hey, what you reading? And he would just always love to know what you were reading. And he kept a list of books, you know, as you shared, he would write things down because this was his way of expanding. And so I wanted to carry that tradition forward on this podcast because I think it is such a fun way to explore books and ideas and new authors. And so I'm going to just ask you the question, Kateri, hey, what you reading?
So I just finished a book that I also go back to pretty frequently. It's Normal People by Sally Rooney, which admittedly, I didn't know about her or hadn't delved into her writing until the Hulu series Normal People came out. And I got like completely addicted to her writing. Maureen Corrigan of NPR did a blurb for the book, and she said that Sally Rooney could write about bath mats and I'd read them. And I could not agree more. This is my third reading of this book, and I don't know, it just feels like a comfort blanket almost, where you can like kind of go in and just like be there and get cozy. And it's heartbreaking, but you know it's going to be heartbreaking. So it's like you can anticipate it. It's a really beautiful book that I assume that I will go back to from years from now.
Excellent. Yeah. And I've heard lots of things about the book, and I know because this is the second, she had conversations with friends and normal people, right? Both of them have become series.
Yeah. And then her newest book, which was, it might've been a year ago now, is called Beautiful World. Where Are You? Maybe. That one is also really good, and I hope they make that into a series, because normally it doesn't translate well, but her books translate really well. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. What are you reading?
Well, there's something about reading books in situ, right? When you're somewhere and reading a book from that place.
Yep.
I recently returned from Scotland, and we spent quite a bit of time up in the Highlands and on the western coast of Scotland. And while we were there, we stumbled into in Applecross, in the Applecross region, which is on the western coast, just a little bit north. If you look out west, if you face out west from Applecross, you're facing just the northern tip of the Isle of Skye, just to kind of give you a situation there. We stumbled into a little craft shop, and in this craft shop, which had all sorts of wonderful local goods, there was a stack of books.
Cool.
One book by one author, this book called His Bloody Project, by an author by the name of Graham McCrae Burnett. And I had heard about the book. Actually, I own an edition, an English, American edition of the book. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize back, I believe, in 2017. But I had not read it yet. And so I picked up another copy because, you got to support authors and publishers wherever you are. And it was the UK edition, which is actually a nicer trim size than the American edition. So it was great. And it's a crime, a historical thriller / crime novel that takes place in the 1860s, 1870s in Scotland, 1880s, like in that latter half of the 19th century. But it revolves around the whole idea of the crofter and the laird idea that is very prominent in that culture. And it takes place in this whole Applecross region. So I started reading it while we were there, and right away I could recognize place names. I could recognize the geography. Yeah. And what Burnett does in this book is fascinating. It's a compilation of various documents relating to a case of a young man who commits murder. And so this young man is very bright. He writes his own story. So we have that. We have this report of a criminal anthropologist. This is kind of a new field, who goes in and analyzes. We have records from the trial. We have records from the police. And so it compiles all this to tell this really, really fascinating story. And the story is a great thriller, but the sense of place is remarkable. And just talking about the conditions, the historical conditions of Scotland, really just made me understand a lot better what I was seeing while I was there. So yeah, it's just a fantastic book. So if you like thrillers, I would definitely recommend it. It's very literary, so but it also moves. So it's a book that will take you through and carry you through. But it's a fun read, and especially if you're going to anywhere near the west of Scotland, you absolutely have to read this book.
I've already added it to my list.
Excellent. There you go. There you go. Well, Kateri, I really appreciate you joining me today, and we're looking forward to a lot of these. For the listener. We will be doing these about every 2 weeks. So pay attention and look for us, but we will be doing new episodes every 2 weeks or so. And again, bringing in authors, bringing in all sorts of professionals throughout the publishing industry to try and give you a comprehensive look at the publishing world. So with that, we wish you well, and we'll talk to you soon, Kateri.
Happy reading.